Okay, so we can start now. My name is Frank Vigneron. I'm the chairperson at the Fine Arts Department, and I will be moderating this talk. I'll start with a quick introduction of Professor Russell. Although,
hi, everyone.
Hi, Ian. It's a little difficult to be short when talking about Professor Russell. If you look at his CV, it's pretty impressive. We haven't met in person, so I only see you through my little screen. And you look like you're 30 years old or something like that. So it's almost impossible to see so much being accomplished. So
way too kind. I'm not that young, but I'll take it.
So he is associate professor now at the Cultural Studies Department at CUHK. Professionally, he introduces himself on this webpage as a contemporary art curator and a cultural brand strategist. He's worked in the US, in Europe, and in China also. As again, his website says, he specializes in art programming, brand strategy, cultural strategies, semiotics, visual identity, and organizational development. I was very intrigued by the fact that you've been performing with the Irish Anuna group for probably over 10 years now. So that's pretty impressive. We will probably ask questions about this later. Before being at CUHK, he was working in a variety of environment in university context, but he was also, for instance, artistic director and chief curator with the K11. He worked at the David Winton Bell Gallery as a curator at Brown University and was lecturer at Rhode Island's School of Design and also at Brown University. I see that you were also assistant professor in a university in Istanbul in Turkey. That must have been quite an experience too. And he was, of course, a fellow in various capacities in other institutions. He's also visiting critic in a number of other universities, in Austin, Texas, for instance, also Rhode Island School and the School of Visual Arts in New York. And today he will give us that presentation on fatigue and recovery. So feel free to send your questions during the talk. We will gather them and answer them as they come after the talk during the Q&A session. Ian, your turn.
Thank you, Frank, for that lovely and very generous and complimentary introduction. I have to say that Hong Kong has helped keep me young. The lifestyle here, the exercise, and the people. The community here is great. So if I look that young, I'm going to give a lot of credit to the fine community that we have in this wonderful city. I also want to quickly thank Max Tang, Dean of the Faculty of Arts at CUHK, and the entire team, Carmen, Ian, Holly, Kubi, and Mian, for helping organize this and all the other great talks that we've had over the last couple weeks. I also need to say one quick word of thanks to friends and comrades in Ireland at Ormston House in Limerick, Ireland. They originally commissioned me to write an essay for a project they called the Sustainability Plan. And that essay commission came to me at a moment when I was going through a lot of stuff. Things were hard, life was changing. And I found it hard to write that essay. I'll just be honest and frank, because I believe that helps all of us make better decisions. And as I was struggling to write the essay, eventually that essay turned into writing about the struggle, meaning it sort of shifted from talking about sustainability to writing about unsustainability. And the more I picked away at it, the more I wanted to understand, it's like, why was I finding it so hard to write and to confront other things that were happening in life? And that period of time, that writing and that chance to think with my partners in Ireland is what started this journey with me thinking a lot more about these issues of fatigue that we're experiencing in the world today. But then optimistically, what are some examples of how we can persist, recover, and indeed, in fact, thrive? So I'm going to start today with something I read a few weeks into the now what we know, the pandemic. At the time, I think we called it an epidemic because it was much more local. This is the cover of the Post magazine from the South China Morning Post from March 22nd. And there was a beautiful long form read in that issue written by Fionnuala McHugh. And the last paragraph it hit me right in my gut. And I just want to share what was said. She says that she watched at the time this boy crying as his mother put a mask on his face. And head to head, she lovingly smoothed it all over his face as he sobbed. And I stopped, and I'll be frank, I teared up because that was the moment reading those words in via Fionnuala's writing about this moment between the son and a mother where I realized something was happening and something was changing. And it was that little boy and his very public emotional expression of how difficult he was finding it that helped me recognize that there's some things that are happening that are changing, not just structurally, but socially and emotionally, that are really hard. And I just want to sort of say that, first off, this is a hard moment. This is a big change, and we're not sure what it's going to look like. And these issues that we're confronting aren't just the obvious outward public ones of masks and faces and so forth, but also it's the way that our lives and daily lives and ways we work with each other are changing. Those readers of the South China Morning Post will probably recognize that there's been some talk over the last few weeks about a thing called Zoom fatigue. Ironically, we're on Zoom today, but there are people all over the world talking about how performing for the camera on Zoom is exhausting. And there's something that is required of us to compensate for the loss of the everyday social interactions, the human interactions, that we try to push through the fiber optics for these computers and our computer screens, that is genuinely exhausting us, that is fatiguing us. And just to quote from Dr. Ting Sik-Chuen from the Department of the Mental Health Foundation, during Zoom meetings, people have difficulties picking up on nonverbal expressions, smiles, winks, or discomfort, and the tone of voice and the hidden emotions that happen in a room. And handling this is really hard. It's exhausting, and we're all experiencing it and going through it right now. This idea of Zoom fatigue actually is part of a much bigger issue of fatigue that we're confronting, which is very important, that recently has been coming through the news, which is called compassion fatigue. And compassion fatigue is predominantly spoken about these days about the trauma that frontline caregivers are experiencing, the nurses, the EMTs, all those incredible people that are helping keep the people that we care about and love, giving them an extra moment, an extra day, an extra week to fight, to their personal fight with the disease that they're confronting. But those caregivers, because they're confronting these issues on such a regular basis, are burning out. And so this issue of compassion fatigue for our caregivers is becoming a medical concern, because there are individuals, tragically, that are suffering deaths of despair because they're finding this work so hard. Quoting from just a recent article in Psychology Today, in COVID-19, compassion fatigue and burnout have seriously affected all of our mental well-being. And this idea of compassion fatigue isn't new. It's not like it's just we figured it out because of the pandemic. It's actually been around for quite a while. Going back maybe about 10 years to the New York Times, there was already talk and concern about broader society becoming numb in terms of caring about so many difficult things that were happening in the world. And Brett Moore, an Army psychologist, helped us start to think about how do we know when we're suffering from compassion fatigue, from caring too much. And in his words, fatigue often results when you're seeing the same problems repeatedly, when they're chronic, and when the outcomes aren't good. One sign that not just caregivers, but all of us can use to notice if we're suffering from that is that you start to hope that your appointments cancel. So if you're a psychiatrist or a medical practitioner, you hope that your patient cancels their appointment to come to you for help. But for all of us, I'm sure we've had those moments when that Zoom meeting you had got canceled and you were relieved. You're like, oh, I'm so glad. Or you actually preemptively hope maybe they'll cancel the Zoom meeting today because I just really can't handle it. If you're having those feelings, you might be experiencing your own version of compassion fatigue. And actually, this issue of compassion fatigue was first talked about back in 1989. This is an article from the Los Angeles Times talking again broadly about the concern of that the more we're connected to each other these days, the more things that we can care about, because the more people you know, the more challenges that you'll hear about, because all of us have challenges. And exponentially, there's just so much to care about. But optimistically, we do know, as courtesy of Dr. Edward Polyandrin from Mount Sinai Hospital in New York, that humans do have a tremendous capacity to be resilient. We know this. They just have to be able to have a chance to replenish their energy. And that's the really important sort of dialectic I want to focus on today. One is admitting and talking about the fact that we're experiencing fatigue in different ways, and that fatigue is hard. And sometimes we can't handle what it is we're being asked to do. And I also want to talk about recovery and the ways that we have and can still persist and maybe thrive. We might be able to find a way to come back in a more exciting and powerful way. Now, amid the scale of the social challenge and changings of COVID-19 pandemic, you probably have heard lots of references or metaphors relating to war, right? How many loss of lives, comparing it to major armed conflicts. And sometimes people talk about the scale of the economics relating to the Great Depression, but often people talk about these numbers and economics in terms of things like World War II. And that is important because we know we survived. But I want to remind us at this moment that while it's understandable that we would appeal to these moments of history to say, hey, look, like this is a big deal, these numbers are important, we also have to remember that those metaphors that we are referring to, specifically, let's take war, and specifically World War II, we're talking about things like this. This is Warsaw in 1945, as it was destroyed by the German forces. And that is a scale of devastation and loss that is profound, and I do not know how to fully comprehend that. But we persisted, we thrived, we came back. The world is still here. And I think rather than focus on the scale of that devastation, but taking heart and taking inspiration from the fact that despite that scale, they were able to find new ways and new systems to persist and move forward. We may be able to do that too in our own way. Now, staying with this moment of World War II, because my field is the arts, I'd like to spend a moment with one artist, one writer that has often inspired me in moments of difficulty, who actually was writing in the aftermath of World War II in the 50s, and that's Samuel Beckett. Samuel Beckett is an Irish writer, playwright, most famously for his plays, but he wrote a trilogy of novels, and the last one of them was called The Unnameable. And in The Unnameable, there's an unnamed protagonist, a person who's broadly meditating on existence. And the last line of that novel is this tripartite quote that often is used: "You must go on. I can't go on. I'll go on." Throughout the novel, that idea of not being able to keep going because of the overwhelming scale of what's happening, that recurs. But this final sort of wrap up in the novel, I find really powerful because you hear the call to action. You have to keep going. But then you immediately hear the very human admission that you just can't do it. Your heart isn't there. You don't have the will and the energy. And then you have this gesture towards the fact that there is still some way that we find to go on. There's something in us that we can pull out. There's something that feeds us. And what that is the question for us to ponder. Now, Beckett, for all of his magic, this is the bard himself here, was very skilled at one thing of giving us energy amidst these insurmountable challenges. And that was wit and irony and maybe a little bit of humor broadly under the umbrella of what was known as absurdism. Later, we call it the absurdist movements. And broadly, that's really thinking about how large the scale of the collapse in Europe was, right? The devastation of the continent, the possible loss of an entire race of people, like how absurd that is. Like how do we understand this? How do we even write poetry at this time? And there's another work by Samuel Beckett that I really love for its spirit around this, which is Waiting for Godot. Waiting for Godot is a play where there are two characters, main characters, Didi and Gogo, who wait. They wait for Godot. The thing is, Godot never comes, never arrives. Similar to the tree behind them that never blooms. They are waiting for something that will never actually arrive during their life, during the duration of the play. And it is kind of like this Sisyphean feeling of like this interminable wait. And it reminds me of how some of us may be feeling these days about like, when will this be over? When will the pandemic stop? When can we go back the way things were? How long do we have to wait? And in the play, Waiting for Godot, there's this wonderful moment between the two characters where one says, I can't go on anymore like this. To which the other responds, that's what you think. Usually the actors deliver it with a certain amount of irony and humor. And there's something really energizing in that, which is this both like tongue-in-cheek, like calling out of like, no, I know you got a little more in you, but also this very human understanding of like empathy of like, I know this is hard. And that spirit is something that I want to hold on to, and we're going to come back to in this talk, is this idea of how we can care for one another, entertain each other, distract one another while we're waiting. But to come back to the issue of exhaustion, something that I think we really need to keep in mind is the pandemic is epic and difficult, but we were already exhausted before this happened in many, many, many profound ways. Winding the clock back a couple of decades, one of the reasons that we're super exhausted, I would like to propose today, is the 24-hour news cycle. Now, that was largely the brainchild of a gentleman named Ted Turner, and I'm sure you're familiar with CNN. CNN, 24-hour news coverage. I mean, there's 24-hour news coverage everywhere. But that wasn't always the case. In fact, one of the things that's really special in Hong Kong that I enjoy, you listen to the radio, I listen to RTHK, and you know, on the hour or half hour, there's this little blip of news that's reported. And then it goes back to music. There's a rhythm to the news, but it's not everything. And it's not all the time. It comes and goes, and that has moments of percolating through life. But 24-hour news is different. It's constant. It's always there. It's always happening. But the thing, I'm sure we're all broadly aware of that. But the thing that we're often not remembering, or it's interesting about the invention of 24-hour news, is that it actually what came from an insight due to insomnia. Originally, CNN, or Ted Turner, when he was thinking about doing news programming, was only doing it because the FCC in the United States had a requirement that every broadcaster had to do a certain amount of news for public service. And so Ted Turner was like, well, we'll do that at night because we're not going to make any money from it. But unexpectedly, they found that insomniacs at night were watching the news. And then because of multiple time zones across the US, people were watching throughout the night. And like it's a few short steps from when you end up with 24-hour news coverage. But that connection, 24-hour news and insomnia, well, I posit like, you know, I can't argue against the idea there being access to more information. That's wonderful. But maybe in us embracing the 24-hour news cycle, have we also embraced a form of insomnia? Carrying on with that theme, Eliza Gabbert, writing in an essay and a poet, writing in The Guardian a few years ago, posited whether this idea of compassion fatigue is inevitable in this age of 24-hour news. She said herself that there's so much bad news that it feels sometimes like we're running out of emotions, that we're drained. And emotions, I mean, that's the special magic energy that we all have to make the amazing creative things happen in the world that we need. Alison Camerota, an anchor on CNN, publicly on air admitted that she was her spirit had been broken, that she suffered from like Trump fatigue from covering the Trump administration. Claude Juncker, the commissioner of the EU, publicly on record admitted that he thought he suffered from Brexit fatigue because it was going on constantly for so long. And other communities and people have talked about this too. In fact, in Turkey, people talk about this almost being a political strategy, that the issue of fatigue from constant contestation and political shifting and changing was exhausting to the point that it made certain parts of the electorate perhaps not be as engaged or as effective. Now, that idea of fatigue and shifting politics is fascinating, but also kind of terrifying when we start to connect the dots. Because that idea of divisiveness, we all know about this idea of polarization, right? Everywhere all over the world is experiencing that right now. In fact, if you permit me staying with the US context, writing around the Obama campaigns, there was an awareness of the first use of social media and the web to develop electoral strategies. And they use those social media strategies to what they, as they could describe, to reach ever thinner slices of the electorate. And that's something that worries me, this idea of thinning, ever thinner, ever more targeted, specialized groups of people. Because the more we thin, if you will, permit me the metaphor, thin our social fabric, the more it frays. And perhaps then it might end up starting to rip and break. And what happens to us when those things start to tear and society starts to unravel? Well, we do know a little bit about that because there are some individuals that are very skilled at it. There's an individual, Vladislav Surkov, who is a special advisor to Putin in Russia. The interesting thing about Vladislav is he is technically a comrade in the arts. Vladislav studied theater at the Moscow Institute of Culture before he eventually moved into a political career. And a BBC documentary filmmaker named Adam Curtis made a film called Hypernormalization, in which he focuses on Surkov as a person, and explores what he is doing and what it's doing to us. Specifically, he posits that Surkov turned Russian politics into a bewildering, constantly changing piece of theater. But the key thing was that Surkov let it be known that he was manipulating things, that was what he was doing, which meant no one knew what actions that were happening in politics were real or fake, because they admitted that they were manipulating things. Peter Pomerantsev, a writer writing in the London Review of Books, an author, expounded on this further in recounting how the Kremlin, under advice from Surkov, would fund both sides of issues. So you'd have like the pro camp funding on one side and the anti-camp funded on the other side, directly by the government. And then they would say publicly that that's what they did. So no one would know where the actual, if you will, authenticity of political action was happening. And so it creates this fog, this confusion that honestly, if you try to wrestle with it, gets exhausting. And more so, it wasn't that they just used that within their sort of stable state structure within Russia. That is a part of a strategy that Surkov has been using, admittedly, publicly, against the West. And so this is in The Independent. Surkov is paraphrased, quoted directly as admitting that he's playing with the West's mind, that the Russian political algorithm had long ago predicted the volatility that we see in Western democracies. And he's using his sort of politics, his theatrical politics of division and sensationalism and emulation to shift things. Now, we know this already, if anyone has been following the news, because the big issue, social media, which we're going to talk about for a little bit, really kind of created a problem for us. And the concrete example is Cambridge Analytica. So this is Mark Zuckerberg testifying in front of the United States Congress around the Cambridge Analytica scandal. And to remind you, what that was is that Cambridge Analytica was able to extract lots of amounts of private data from Facebook, from user profiles, and then use that to create very specialized targeting of individuals. Now, that targeting isn't just based on people's interests and likes. It actually was done using really sophisticated psychological profiling. They called it psychographic micro-targeting, was the phrase that they used. And researchers at Stanford Business School confirms that that form of psychological targeting is not only possible, but it's incredibly effective as a tool of digital mass persuasion. So we start to see how these digital tools that are connecting us together, that are built on this sort of idea of constantly sharing information, reaching out to one another, if you permit me to connect to the 24-hour news cycle, they are actually also making us perhaps vulnerable. They may be exhausting us because we're getting so much information, and it may make us more malleable and shiftable or dividable, partable, maybe. Now, there is also another fact that's been confirmed, which is the way we use social media affects us emotionally. This is the Pew Research Center. They did a large-scale study on the cost of care and caring with social media. And what they found is that emotions, in a way, are very contagious through social networks. And the emotion that's almost most contagious is stress and anxiety. And so these tools that we're using are, in some ways, we could argue, perfect for amplifying stress, anxiety, and creating exhaustion and fatigue. Now, then that causes the question, well, then why is it that on the news we hear so much about Donald Trump's tweets or whoever's tweets or whoever's social media posts? Well, Matthew Ingram from the Columbia Journalism Review asked that question about why do journalists pay so much attention to Twitter? And he, I think, very generously admits that the lure of an always-on, news-heavy social network like Twitter that includes access to not just an audience of consumers, you and me, but direct input from newsmakers like Donald Trump is impossible for many in the media to resist because it's perfect for what they do, their business of getting information out and making sure people are engaged and listening. So the news, the media, understands the value. And let's remember, many media organizations are businesses, so they understand how to translate this into capital, to money. Businesses also understand this. And so this is the CEO of Hootsuite writing in Fast Company magazine about how to turn your entire staff in your company into a social media army. And the way that he was proposing you do that, it's not through special social media training. It's about creating what was called employee advocacy programs, encouraging staff to share updates about the brand of the company on their private social media accounts. So let's be clear, we're not talking about a corporate social media profile that you only have to check because it's your job. It's initiatives within companies to get employees to use their own personal private space. That would be like putting an ad on the front of your house, just because you feel like doing it, as a form of brand advocacy work. So no wonder we're exhausted, because that's been going on for a long time. This is Paul Virilio, a well-known philosopher who wrote a great book called The Information Bomb. And in it, he reminds us that it wasn't that long ago that the cell phone, when it was introduced, shattered or allowed companies to shatter the separation between work hours and private life. All of a sudden, you could get phone calls for work on the beach. And it's pitched to you as a great way to manage your time and get more work done and be more productive. Productive for who? For you? For the company? And the social media, Zoom, Twitter, Facebook, all of it, it's just extended this situation, the abolishment of the distinction between working hours and private life. So no wonder we're having trouble sleeping. No wonder we're exhausted. No wonder we're fatigued. The scary part of this is when you look back about a little more than a decade, this is 2008, all of the major tech companies in Silicon Valley came together to actually start a major research initiative to explore the negative effects of too much email. So they found that their own employees were suffering and being less productive because there was too much digital communication going on. One specific example, Intel, the major chip maker, I think the processors in many of your computers are probably from Intel, found that over an 8-month period where they encouraged some employees to limit their digital interruptions, so less messages, less emails, said that they were more productive and creative as a result. So less mediation, less digital communication, less Zoom resulted in more productivity, more creativity, maybe more energy. And I would say probably because there's less fatigue. And recently in the Straits Times, Chua Ming-Hung noted that when these tech founders warn us about social media fatigue themselves, they're basically saying, my product exhausts you. We really need to stand up and pay attention. It's time to listen. Steve Jobs didn't let his kids play with iPads. Bill Gates' kids only got phones when they were 14. And in fact, one of the founders of Facebook thinks that Facebook damages human brains. I don't know if that's true or not. But when the founders, the creators of these things have these concerns, well, shouldn't we as a general population be concerned? And we should certainly be concerned when they start to be rolled out as large-scale initiatives, as it was recently done in Kansas, this US state of Kansas. This is outside of the city of Wichita, where an organization called Summit Learning, which is an initiative by Mark Zuckerberg and his wife Priscilla Chan, basically transformed the public school classrooms into digital classrooms, meaning kids went to school, but they got all of their tuition on computers. So all of the teaching, the lessons, was screen-based, computer-based lessons and work. The in-person teachers were transformed into being mentors and facilitators for the online learning experience. And unfortunately, it wasn't that long until kids started coming home with repetitive stress injuries in their hands and arms and bad back pain and stress and anxiety and nightmares and weren't able to sleep very well. To the extent that when they surveyed parents of teachers in McPherson, in the district of McPherson, their middle school, 77% of the respondents said they preferred their child not be in a classroom that uses Summit Learning. And more than 80% said their children had expressed concerns about the platform themselves. So Silicon Valley, trying to basically hack public education, turn it into a system that will have to use the tools that they build. People locally saying it's not healthy, it's hurting us. And meanwhile, all of the people who work in these companies in Silicon Valley, shouldn't say all, apologies, many, don't send their kids to these types of schools. They raise their kids tech free. And that should be a major, major, major red flag. A 2017 survey conducted by the Silicon Valley Community Foundation found that among 907 Silicon Valley parents, that despite high confidence in technology's benefits broadly, many parents have serious concerns about tech's impact on their kids' psychological and social development. Well, that's something we should certainly be thinking about. And I challenge us as a community, as a society, our institution, CUHK, we're using tools like Zoom. It's our job. We need to think about this seriously, because we are fast rushing forward into a world where private brand and corporations are becoming the verbs that we use to communicate. You Instagram something, you Google something, you pin something. We're using the words of corporations to replace what were common human actions of care and sharing and storytelling. It's becoming a part of our life in a very deep way. And we also know that those tools aren't perfect. They're problematic. They're dangerous, perhaps, and they certainly exhaust us in many ways. We have to pause. We have to think about that. Because while we are having these types of conversations, there are families that are sending kids under the age of 13 to YouTube camps, not organized by YouTube, but camps that specialize in helping young children learn how to become YouTube video makers so they can be influencers. And the issue about this is that YouTube has an age restriction, so you have to be over the age of 13 to post content. But these camps have figured out a way to work with parents so that children under the age of 13 can create content and then have their parents upload it for them. And that kind of situation, that type of just wholesale endorsement, leaning into these tech platforms, is having potential major consequences for what our community and society is going to look like in future. And the reason I think that's a major concern, we can debate about what culture or how we create our art should look like. And I'm broadly open to how this thing look. But the thing that I think is really important is what underlies the idea of the influencer, what underlies the idea of the content producer, is this pressure to perform. And I mean perform, not like do your job, but pressure to perform, like Zoom, where we have to compensate for being away from you. You all, the 100 or so of you who are wherever around the world, I get no energy from you because you're not in the room with me. I'm having to compensate for my own performance now. And every YouTube video maker has to do that same kind of work. And that work is in itself very exhausting. There is a general concern that beyond just digital technology, this idea of performance culture, of entertaining one another with, incredible stories and exciting dramatic gestures, that these are ways that we actually are damaging ourselves because we are expending so much energy just to satisfy this idea of how we're supposed to perform and look for one another, rather than just being who we are. Quoting from Lindsay Holmes from the Huffington Post, when we're expected to perform, whether it's at the World Series, baseball, at an auto show, or at our desks on an average Tuesday, we likely, when we want to perform, put our immediate health low on our priority list, meaning the priority becomes performing rather than paying attention to what we're feeling, how we are doing, and what we may need to sustain ourselves. Now, I don't want to be too negative about all of these tools, because tools can be used to good and bad ends. And things like Zoom are incredibly important. We're using it today. People are using it all over the world to connect, to have yoga classes or meditation sessions, because we need that right now. We need to connect and speak with one another. The only thing I just want to remind us is that these tools are problematic. And as we allow them to be integrated into our rhythm and our lifestyle to change, we need to also hold on to a critical perception, critical awareness about their limitations, the things we're losing, and the actual potential harm that they could accelerate. So coming to the conclusion of what I'd like to share with you today, I'd like to spend a little bit to think about what are ways that we can maybe resist some of these pressures, the pressure to perform. What are the ways that we can persist as humans within this massive change? Meaning, I know we're socially distanced, but there's a way for us to persist in terms of being social and human and connected to one another. Gesturing to an arts writer who has influenced me, Jan Verwoerd, he wrote a wonderful essay called Exhaustion and Exuberance, and in it, he questions, what would it mean to put up resistance against a social order in which high performance has become a growing demand, if not a norm? What would it mean to resist the need to perform? And think about that, Zoom. Zoom is just ubiquitous now. So we're going to feel more pressure to perform in these types of talks. Case in point, I decided today to try to use the virtual background function for Zoom to create a green screen so that I could share content almost like I'm on like TV, like I'm a news broadcaster. Like I'm already adopting this performative position of trying to compensate and perform more. What would it mean or look like if we resisted that? What are ways that we, or at a minimum, how can we think about it to help us individually orient ourselves? And I suggest that one thing that's important for us to keep in mind is that while many of the things we feel are individual and some of us may be be alone, we have to be careful socially to not relax into this old myth of the heroic individual who sacrifices everything in order to overcome and save the day, right? It's also like a Hollywood trope, right? This idea of like the hero who comes in individually and saves us all. Because that idea of the heroic individual saving us, usually relies on some form of that hero self-exploiting, right? And one could argue that every moment that you heroically choose to do another Zoom call, you're self-exploiting, sustaining a system that may actually be exhausting everyone. Those of you who are on the call right now who might be in a business, I'm sure you all have been in a meeting where you're like, why are we having this meeting? We're all exhausted. Someone felt like they had to, and that was the right thing to do. But maybe if you pause and check with the group, you might realize that the meeting might not be necessary, that actually we're very tired, and our productivity would go up if we didn't have it. Similarly to how, well, almost 15 years ago, tech companies realized that let's actually not have people email as much. So maybe it's not about individual acts of self-exploitation or heroism. Maybe it's about recognizing that all of us are having a very hard time. And maybe we need to think about this not in terms of defeating, right? This victim and defeat, the person who is lost or those who survive, these like war metaphors. Maybe we need to think about this more as a community of people who are sick, convalescing. Like we're suffering through something very, very hard, but we are together. There's a community of people who experience certain difficulties or certain traumas or certain diseases together. There are communities that are very much today emerging because of their shared trauma of this moment relative to being a frontline caregiver or maybe being a patient within a ward. Maybe that form of collectivity about exhaustion, about not being able to sacrifice anyone to heroically save everyone else, a way for us to work together to try to care for the group. Maybe there's another way for us to do this in a more sustainable way. And to think about that, I'd like to turn back to something we spoke about more at the beginning. And so we're going to talk about recovery. And we're going to go back to World War II and this really tragic moment of absolute devastation. I mean, we're talking a lot, like the hospitals are gone, the schools are gone, it's all gone. What do we do? And people found a way to come together and think about really big idealistic things. And I can't really get more bold or more utopic than the UN. It was in the wake of World War II, that absolute moment of complete exhaustion and fatigue and just immense, immeasurable loss, when the nations of the world, the people of the world, came together to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime, has brought untold sorrow. This statement is profound because it's not about them. It's not saying we are founding the UN to save ourselves from war. They're saying they did this because they want to save future generations because of the things they experienced in their life. Meaning they weren't necessarily going to see the fruits of this effort. They may have to wait a very long time for the world that they were trying to create to emerge. But that optimism, that spirit of knowing that the efforts you're putting in now, though you may have to wait a long time and you may not see the results, may yield incredible results for those that come after. Such as the EU, the European Coal and Steel Community was founded shortly after the UN, and it's basically largely the progenitor of what is now the European Union, an incredible post-national project. Right? This optimism of believing that there's a new way for us to think and work together, to be connected, but to be connected in a different way because the systems that had existed didn't work and they faltered and fell apart. But these efforts aren't just relied on the acts of the privileged, powerful politicians and business people. They also rely on these disciplined, beautiful, everyday moments that sustained people, that persisted through that devastation, such as women in Britain who worked through piles of scrap fabric to salvage them for the war effort. And think about that, the idea of taking all these disused, torn garments and knitting them back together to try to bandage or build something that could care for, maybe fight, but care for their community. taking those tattered fabrics, respecting each one for its own color and beauty, but realizing that they all are knit together into something far bigger that we all need to think about how to sustain and care for. And to conclude, I'd like to turn back to the sector that has supported me and that I enjoy working in, which is the arts. There's another incredible effort like the UN, like the EU, that happened right after World War II that is incredibly inspiring for what it achieved despite all of the odds. And that's the Edinburgh Festival. The Edinburgh Festival was founded in 1947 in the city of Edinburgh in Scotland. And the reason for that partially is geographic. Edinburgh was largely, generally, in terms of infrastructure, was untouched by the damage from the war. And they, artists in the UK and from around Europe came together to realize that they might be able to found here a place that could heal the wounds of a divided Europe through art and free expression. Before I talk more about the Edinburgh Festival, just think about that, a place that was sort of okay, able to step forward and open itself to the world, to help the world to think differently and move forward together in a more open and sustainable way. That might be the kinds of challenges that we here in Hong Kong, a city that is doing measurably compared to other places, doing well. Now, I know things may change and we have different difficulties, but I encourage us, those of us who live in places that may be enjoying a certain form of stability right now, where are the ways that we might be able to think about these kind of efforts? So the Edinburgh Festival, founded in 1947, has another interesting part to it, because when it was founded, it was a formal institutional festival and they invited some theater groups to perform. But there were some theater groups in the UK that weren't invited, and they thought that was wrong. And so instantaneously, right, at the same moment, the theater companies that weren't invited founded the Fringe. So in the same year, from the beginning, you had an institutional establishment, right, an establishment cultural organization, and you had its critical opposition, if you will, its dialectical opposed. So you had the insiders and the outsiders. And from the beginning, you had this beautiful balance of structure and critique. And the reason I want to point that out as something that's so important is when you have that, a form of respect for something that needs to be done together, creating a place to celebrate art and free expression. You have people who have to make tough decisions about, okay, we're going to fund these things, we're going to build this building. But you also have to have the people that are supported and allowed to say, I don't like that, or I don't agree, and no. Neither one of those supplants the other. And it's the dialogue between those two is what makes the Edinburgh Festival so special. And one of the largest, if not the largest, one of the largest arts events in the world anywhere, you know, comparable to things like the Olympics. Thinking about how we can build new structures, but it's not about necessarily getting it right. It's about building a structure and then letting it be open to others saying how you might have gotten it wrong or might need to change some things, and continuing that iteration, that conversation of structure, building, and critique, change. That form of dialectic that bridges or undercuts the political divisions that we might be experiencing today is vital. And that, I believe, is something that we need to fight for. Now, another very concrete thing that we can do and think about is planting some seeds. This is the artist Joseph Beuys in 1982 in the city of Kassel in Germany, and he's planting the first tree of one of his major artworks called 7,000 Eichen, 7,000 oak trees, which was part of Documenta 7 in that city, major art event. And what's significant is they're planting trees throughout the city, you know, like maybe a city authority might. But these are artists and everyday citizens planting these trees. Now, Joseph Beuys is no longer with us, and it may be the case that many of these people in this photograph may or may not still be with us. But the thing that still is with us are the trees. So now, Kassel is a beautiful tree-lined city, and there's shade everywhere. And there's better air, there's clean air, because as we know, trees help rebalance a healthy environment. And that environment, what we enjoy, or the citizens of Kassel may enjoy today, isn't something that Beuys or his contemporaries were able to experience themselves. They didn't do it for themselves. They did it and took care of it for the people that were going to come after. And I think that's the thing that we need to be thinking about. What are the small things and actions we might be able to do today? What are the seeds we could plant, the tree we could plant, that we may not be able to see its fruit, which is difficult. We may wait a long time, but we know that one day it will leaf. And so to return finally to Beckett and to waiting for Godot, it's like Didi and Gogo waiting for something that will never arrive under a tree that has no leaves. And it's not about focusing on the sadness. We admit it. We know that it's difficult and it's sad. What it's about is knowing that life does go on. Leaves do come back. And maybe Godot will come at some point. But whether or not Godot comes, what's beautiful about that play and what can be beautiful about our time right now is how we choose to be with each other during that time. The way Didi and Gogo crack jokes, poke fun, find ways to make light, but also moments of significance to appreciate the gravity of what they're experiencing and confronting. That's something that we can do together. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. That was wonderful. About the Edinburgh Festival, that's basically my best memory of my late teenage years. I remember spending 2 weeks there. It was exhausting, basically 2 plays a day and the concert at night. It was fantastic. So, all right. So please, everyone, feel free to ask some questions. You can do this in the question and answer windows that you can open. And since there are no questions yet, I will start, okay?
Sure.
And, I was thinking, you're talking about Beckett using the word fatigue, and I couldn't help thinking that those were 2 French language related things. Fatigue is a French word, Beckett wrote in French.
Fatigue.
And my question will be about neoliberalism. I guess like most academics in the humanities, I'm very much against it. And that's another very negative French word I was thinking about, which is, of course, laissez-faire. And, we're talking about all these comments we see in the news, in newspapers, absolutely everywhere of what you talked about too, that, we're living disastrous period, that, things will collapse and everything. And I was wondering whether these comments are really coming from usually people who thinks about economics in terms of neoliberalism, which is very short term. Everyone worries about the next quarter, basically. And I was wondering what your thoughts were about maybe the possibility that fatigue is a neoliberal consequence.
Absolutely. I mean, I think you're spot on with that. I guess we can speak specifically about neoliberalism, but I'm going to speak broadly about capitalism, which is obviously one of the hallmarks. Capitalism is largely about a form of, in a nice way, converting, right? Like labor into money and vice versa, money controlling people. But this issue about how we people can be turned into something else, that transformative thing, I think can be very violent, and at a minimum it certainly can be very exhausting. And the thing from the arts, the one thing I think about in terms of capitalism and neoliberalism as a concern is like the punk movement. And so 60s, 70s, 80s, and arguably even till today, like punk emerged as this really defiant act of actually intentional waste. Like I'm going to get wasted. I'm going to exhaust myself so the system can't exhaust me anymore. And it was this grand performance of that. And I think that punk, and this is, again, it predates, if we would say, the broad-based public discussion about neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is around, but I think punk exposed that because they if you will, almost subjugated themselves to it to expose it. if those who identify as punk people would allow me, if the Sex Pistols would allow me to say, like, I think they willfully sacrificed, if you will, themselves and their bodies performatively to show us that this system exhausts us, and then, turned that into this grand performance orgy, if you will, of waste and angst. So yeah, I think that it's definitely, there's a fundamental connection between neoliberal orders and getting as much out of people as you can, which ultimately that type of thinking, I think, leads to exhaustion. I see we've got some questions that have come in on the Q&A system. Is that something you can see too, Frank?
I do. I'm hoping everyone can see the questions, but I don't want to read them out.
I can read them. I'm happy to read them.
Maybe go ahead and just answer some of them if you want.
I'll just sort of dive in. And so the first one, Cameron wrote, hello, I have a question for Ian. With virtual classroom and meetings being the mainstream to communicate during the coronavirus pandemic, a decrease in creativity and the development of fatigue seems inevitable. How would you minimize the tiredness developed from prolonged usage of the applications? And how to preserve the creativity or keep our fresh mind during those meetings? Thank you for your kind sharing. Great question. Thank you so much, Cameron, for that. I really appreciate that. Practically speaking, how do you minimize the tiredness? So the first thing I would say is, be careful about how much you commit to, right? So that's the first line of defense. If someone's asked you 10 or 20 Zoom meetings, and you only have time for 5, only do 5. Don't take on extras. The other things to do, in meeting, is recognizing that we get very tired staring at screens. So know that it's okay to look away, right? It's okay to not have to be constantly looking at the screen and making eye contact with the person on the screen. Release yourself. And in fact, if everyone on a Zoom call lets themselves release from the lock of the eye gaze to move a little more, look away, step and move, that helps. Also, your body is moving. But it's a known thing that, taking a break every 15 minutes or whatever to look, and ideally you want to look at something far away. So I would say that if you can during a long Zoom thing, take a break every once in a while, and even for 30 seconds, but ideally a minute or two, look out the window at something far away and let your eyes adjust to that way of looking rather than looking at something close. That will certainly help a lot. And the creativity thing, I think that this is sort of a tricky one or a tough one because many of us are isolated. Those of you who have a creative practice, pursue it. Music, do that, whatnot. Those of you who haven't, I'd say the two things is, don't put pressure on yourself to feel like you should be painting or you should be doing carpentry. That's sort of defeating. But let yourself play again. Try if you can to remember maybe what it was like being a kid, or if there are children around, hang out with them. Notice how kids have no problem picking up a block of wood and basically creating a play. They tell a story and they perform. They have no problem sort of making that leap. And try to find a way to let yourself just be bored and then imagine something different. Let your mind wander. It's a hard thing to do, but what it is sort of, don't follow the rabbit down the hole of anxiety, because there's so much happening. It's happening so quickly and it's so big. There are many things that we cannot control, but the things we can control is how we choose to react to the changes, right? So I'm not saying it's stressful, what's going on is hard. So we know that, but we can still choose to take moments to pause, to think about beauty, to laugh, tell a joke. It's okay to do that, okay? So that would be my 2 quick sort of bits of advice. And please feel free to reach out and have conversations. I'm happy to talk more with anyone who's looking for ideas. Jennifer Eagleton says, what do you think of all the things appearing on Facebook that people are doing while self-isolating, creative and quite funny things? What do you think of this? I think 2 things. One, it's wonderful that they're being creative. I think that's, more humans being out in the world, doing something that's fun, inspiring, great. The thing that I also think that I'm a little concerned about is there are people who are doing that I would say, not just for them to have fun. They're doing it to show other people that they're being creative, or to show other people that they're having fun. And that attitude, the influencer attitude, creates, I would say, more pressure on other people, right? I definitely had this brief period in the first couple of weeks of like, oh, well, I'm supposed to be doing all these creative things right now. And I realized it's like, I can't do that. I don't have it in me. And I'm not going to let there be like peer pressure to be more creative, or that I need to make this the most meaningful creative moment in my life. My life is always the most meaningful moment in my life every day. And I practice acceptance, in sense of like, this is what my day is like today, and this is how much energy I have to bring to it. So on the one hand, if you feel like you're doing something creative, you want to share with people, do it, absolutely. And I just say, well, question your intentions. Why are you sharing it? Are you sharing it because it's genuinely going to help other people? Or are you sharing it to influence or put pressure on other people? I would just sort of pause and think about that. Anonymous wrote, do you have any specific advice on overcoming compassion fatigue while not giving this important quality up? Important quality, about compassion, I think, without giving up compassion. I can speak advice. I mean, I think, so compassion fatigue is something we do talk about specifically regarding medical care, frontline medical care practitioners. And we are, in certain places in the world, in a crisis. And crises require different types of management. And I am not an expert in making recommendations for what to be done there. And I'm just grateful for those who are meeting those challenges. What I would say for us is, for those of us who aren't frontline medical care people, I would say, if any, actually, I'll just tell a personal story. My cousin, so I have two cousins. I have more than that, but I have two of my cousins live outside of New York City in Western Connecticut. One is an EMT. She works on ambulances, and she's told some very harrowing stories. The other one is an undertaker and works in a funeral home, and also has told me some very harrowing stories. And just last week, on a random moment, I was listening to I was listening to NPR in the US, and they happened to be interviewing a funeral director. And I was listening a little bit to what that person was saying. And I just had this moment of wanting to reach out to John, my cousin, a guy to another guy. We don't usually write to each other emotionally, but I wrote to him and I was like, I really want to tell you how amazing I think you are. And like, what you're doing is really special. I love you. I'm proud of you. And, basically I want you to know that I am thinking of you, and I will always remember what it is that you're doing right now. And he responded and opened up in such a beautiful way. And I won't go into it because it's private, but like, it was really nice. And what I would say is, that's something that we can do. Find ways to open up emotionally and humanly to the people that may be at the front line experiencing this, and let them talk and let them feel. And maybe, for those you can, like, find ways to take care of them, make a little food for them. Maybe it's paying for some spa treatments for nurses afterwards. I don't know if you've seen photographs. This is something real, but the face masks that are worn in certain places in the US, in New York, I know, the suction cup masks, they create bruising on people's faces, and it's brutal. So there's a lot of narratives that are happening right now around compassion fatigue that I think there are ways that we can practice, those who are not caregivers can practice compassion for them. Separately, thinking about the broad thing of like, how do you, like the broad general human population about compassion fatigue regarding general issues, I would say the main thing is moderate your news intake. Like, tune in when you can, but be present where you are, because news generally is constantly giving us more anxiety. I mean, there's certain things we need to know the information, the actionable information, but the other stuff, the noise, the comments, right? The debates, like, try to tune that out some and focus more on the stories that you can take action around, the things that you can care about. So maybe I'm an exception. I live in the US, or sorry, I lived in the US, so I have family there. So I do think about US politics, but maybe for those of us who don't live in the US, we don't need to know quite as much about what's happening in the White House. It's great news, right? It's fun, it's entertaining because it's a drama. But I don't think it's actually creating the types of conversations that are helping us or supporting us. So that's a very concrete thing that I think I would recommend, is those of us who may be reading the news too much, maybe read a little less. Another anonymous said, yesterday, Hong Kong people just experienced many unjust issues and decisions that many of us do not have power to change. Knowing that justice may only arrive like 10 or 30 years later, even later, how to persist. Right. Well, this is big. And what I would say is you're not alone. There are communities around the world who have gone through incredible, difficult moments where it took decades to realize some type of shift or change. And I would say thinking about the big story is the way to hold on. And in a sense, I actually like to think about a metaphor. There's a book by, actually, I'll show you. There's a book by Richard Andrews that I'm reading right now. Oh, you can't see it. Okay, I'm holding a book. Oh, you kind of can. It's called The Overstory, Overstory. It's about trees. Overstory is the like canopy of trees, but he uses it as like a device about the bigger story, like trees outlive us. So what are the bigger stories that we can keep in mind that help us realize that we're playing roles right now? We may not see the results of them, but it doesn't diminish the importance of it. And we can be fed by the future that we know will come, and really celebrating that future. And those who choose to may need to fight or take action. But I would say that there's a really important role for storytelling right now. And I don't mean to sell anything. I mean, storytelling is like telling us the story of that beautiful future, that beautiful place, the world that we can imagine in the future. So I would say, like, writers of Hong Kong, I want to know what you think Hong Kong is going to be like. What could it be like, right? Like, we know what's going on, we experience it now, and we all want things to be better. So let's start to talk about, like, what is that going to feel like? What could that feel like? Some of that optimistic creativity might be a way that I would encourage those who feel so called to do. Wai Lok Chung writes, the Leviathan creature that comes out seems to obligate us to pay attention to all information and misinformation, leaving private individuals no liberties to pursue their private interests. I like your poetry, by the way. Is the corresponding fatigue really something one could have eliminated given society as it is? Certainly it ought to be that we're not obligated to keep paying attention to anything that seeks it all the time. Yes, I think what you said at the end is absolutely spot on. I often think about every person who ends up being a parent, choose your own parenting strategy. But I sometimes think about parenting where parents sometimes have to be like, yeah, the kid's screaming, they just have to learn to deal with it, and you leave them alone. You don't react to everything. You can't always be there. And so I think, yes, that's the crucial thing, is being able to, to borrow your words, don't feed the Leviathan, decide what it is that you're going to engage and what you want to speak about. Another anonymous said, I find losing a sense of time passing when staying home during the virus break. Oh, like a loss of sense of time. Yeah. Sometimes ending up in fantasizing or drowning in memory and working really inefficiently. Oh, any good advice? Yeah. Well, so the fantasizing part sounds nice. I don't know you, but I'm going to assume that is perhaps fun or inspiring. So if that's the case, that's great, and it's totally natural. I would also say, like, emotions are natural. Whatever you're feeling is okay, and it's important to talk about it and to share that with people in the ways that you feel are okay and safe. Drowning in memories. So I would say, like, that's tough, because if those memories are hard, yeah, that can be a really, really difficult thing. And I would just counsel you to reach out to people that you can, to share those memories with others in a safe way, safe people, whether those are caregivers or whether they're friends or family. But memories are stories, and I think finding ways to share that, reach out. If you have a memory that's about a friend, let's just take an easy one, a friend who's nice, that you like, that you remember, just write him a note real quick, share it. Like, don't edit that, like reach out. That's you feeling like you want to connect. And the working really inefficiently. So per my tact in my talk, if you permit me, I'm going to sort of say, I don't think you need to work efficiently. I don't think that's the point right now. I don't think that's super important. Now, if you have specific challenges and things you need to get done, then like identify your priorities and establish your steps to get there, and make them small and achievable and work on them every day, like a small step every day. That would say, so if it's something important. But if it's just generally you're feeling inefficient, let yourself feel inefficient. We're exhausted right now, and it's okay to be tired. It's okay to say, I can't do any more right now. That is an okay feeling. And in fact, when you're feeling that, that's usually a sign that if you don't deal with that, meaning rest, convalesce, you may end up putting yourself at risk. You know, a different example would be someone who's an athlete. When they find that their body is fatigued, I used to run marathons, and like I would be tired at a certain point. And I can tell you, I would always notice when I should have stopped running, because I kept going, and 3 miles later, my knee gives out because your body breaks down. The fatigue comes first, and the injury and the hurt will follow if you don't listen to it. So I would just counsel you that. Another anonymous says, thanks for your presentation. As you have mentioned, that we all face fatigue in our lives, especially nowadays tech world. It seems difficult to abandon technology in our daily life, as it's probably our needs to tackle so many things in our life, e.g. continuing Zoom lessons for students during pandemic of COVID-19, maintaining social distancing as well as social interaction, home office for maintaining our salary. Yeah. But technology seems to destroy our life gradually. It is nearly no way to solve this realistic problem, at least at the moment. You're right in the sense that there's no immediate fix. Like, we're sort of in a bit of a crisis. We can't suddenly, like, you know, make us all be able to live the way we used to be, and things are going to be different. So I think in the short term, like, to use a therapeutic metaphor, like from counseling or psychotherapy, we're coping right now. We're coping with a very difficult time. And they're like, if you're, one way that you cope is like eating macaroni and cheese, or it's eating cookies, right? Or chocolate. Like, that's okay. It's okay to eat a lot of chocolate for a little period of time, but you don't want to create a whole new lifestyle where all you eat is chocolate. So I think that's the issue, is it's recognizing that this tool is very effective in certain instances to help sustain certain experiences and certain conversations. But I can offer personally, for me, like, this moment is making me be more present in Hong Kong than I've ever been before, because I'm not going to travel to see people I care deeply about back in Ireland or in the US right now. And so I need to focus on my neighbors, my friends here, which I already focused on, but I'm realizing that that is a change that's happening. But Zoom is here, and it allows me to connect it to some of those people. And I love that, and it's great. And I use it intentionally to talk to my brothers every week. But I'm not going to just talk to my family on Zoom for the rest of my life. I will find ways to travel when that's appropriate. And we're all working to that end. So I would say it's okay, you're right, but don't despair. As long as we remember, and I think our bodies will remember, right, what it felt like to be more normally socially human, things will adjust. But the way that what will happen is if we stay aware of it, and in your office, in your work, or in your university, when there's a motion to make everything have to suddenly use Twitter and Facebook and Zoom permanently, maybe that you raise your hand and say, I'm not sure that that's a great normative policy for our institution. I think we should think about this in a more nuanced way. Like, there needs to be conversation about that. So let's see, Jenny Wu says, hi, Ian and Frank. Hi. While you are having a positive outlook towards the future, some of us, including me, are not really suffering from the fatigue of Zoom meetings. Rather, I'm actually suffering from the fatigue of all those negative media and fake news for media and my acquaintances, other people. How do you see this aspect being continuously amplified and non-ceasing? I think that's probably what you mean. Non-ceasing, not ending. Yeah, I mean, I think this is sort of one of the reasons I wanted to give this talk today, is to open up a space to talk about the fact that we're all cycling and sharing anxiety and stress and negativity amongst each other. I think that each one of us has a role to play to change the conversation. You know, I usually don't get overt with some of my positions, but like early on when certain shifts were happening in US politics, it was very clear. It's like, people need to ignore, like, this is a person who loves being on TV, and now they have the biggest TV camera in the world. Don't give the eyeballs. Give the eyeballs to the things that deserve it, but don't give it all the time. But the media loves it because it works perfectly, right? It's perfect. It's great TV. It's great entertainment because it's shocking and everything. But there's a lot of news cycles that are a waste of time because it's just talking about what someone said. It's basically, a lot of it is gossip. And I remember a time when news wasn't gossip. It was like investigative journalism and comment and critique. And that is something I think we need to get back towards. So what I would say is, I think something we can do is with our acquaintances is try to find moments to open up space to talk about things in more in-depth ways and not so reactionary. It's very easy to go like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that this person said this, or this happened, oh my God, and react and be shocked. That's very easy, and it's intoxicating, and it's like eating lots of cookies. It's addictive. What we need to find is a way to pause, step back, and then have a bigger conversation. Like, well, what's really going on here? Like, why is that happening today? Why is that institution saying this? Not, oh my God, I can't believe they said it. Be like, why is that happening? Realizing the bigger context and enjoy that conversation. I would say that's the thing. It's Matt, his name is escaping me at the moment, but the founder of the RSA in the UK. Apologies, Matthew. I'm just forgetting your last name. You're really important and famous. But he used to be a advisor to Blair's government in the UK. And I, early on in my life, managed to get in contact with him because I was trying to figure out what to do in my life. One of the things that happened in that conversation was like, what does motivate you? And the thing that motivated him, like, why did he fund some of the think tanks that he did? He says, like, he was really, really disappointed with the quality of political conversation and that there needed to be more spaces to have better conversation. He wasn't dictating left, right, in support of whatever. What he was in support of was better conversation, more engaged, more interesting. And I think that's the thing to really keep in mind is I think a lot of us understandably are very attached to positions. And that means that we end up just reacting in either a positive or a negative way to every single story that happens, rather than enjoying being part of a conversation that's good and engaging where there are multiple positions. I enjoy when I get to talk to someone who's of a different political stance that is willing to have that kind of conversation. It's incredibly enriching. Unfortunately, we aren't role modeling that. Like, maybe we role model at some universities, maybe. I will say, hats off to Hong Kong. At least a lot of the English language news that I get to read here still feels like newspapers that I used to read 10, 20 years ago. Like, newspapers in the other parts of the world have changed dramatically. And there's still an element of that here that I think is very special, that we should celebrate and support. Another anonymous, the level of resilience seems different for many people. Depends on many factors. For example, genetics, resources, social support, community government, cultures, religions, maybe even hierarchy sometimes. Absolutely. How can we tackle this problem? How can we persist optimistically or keep resilience or even help others to be resilient? Yeah. So you're absolutely right. And this is where the sort of end of my talk was wanting to talk about these big structural proposals. There's a lot of effort right now in many parts of the world to like call out and tear down structures, which is understandable, and it's a necessary process of critique, I believe. But there's so much effort, I think, sometimes in, quote, tearing certain things down, but maybe not as much time or effort put into what are we going to build, building the other thing. At the end of the day, like what's going to help and care for other people is supporting and building and supporting systems and institutions that provide resources to care for people. And I mean, the only thing you need to know as a proof of that is one institution that, you know, very powerful, privileged people are fighting very aggressively to support and maintain the market, like the free neoliberal global market, the economy, like the massive argument, which is if there's capitalism and lots of money, everyone's okay. Like that's the basic proposition. So they're fighting tooth and nail to hold on to the way the world used to work in some way, shape, or form, or try to get ahead of the change so they can dictate and control the change. And I would say that this is an incredible moment for us as citizens to start to recognize like, oh, actually, there are systems that aren't working right. There's things that I might be able to do or get engaged in locally. That's what I would say. I mean, like those of you who are in Hong Kong, this is a great moment to figure out who your local district councilor is and reach out to them and just say, what are you doing? Are there any initiatives happening in my neighborhood where we might be able to provide some help or support? I think asking the question is the important thing. For myself, I know my local district councilor and have reached out, and I'm looking forward to trying to help where I can. Here, that's a small first step that I can participate in that may turn into things being established where I live. And that's something that I know that I can do. And I think those actions support the people who are in positions to take other actions and so forth. And then maybe that will become some of the change that we're hoping for. And lastly, Anonymous writes, how can people persist if they are fatigued to the extent that they almost reach the stage, learned helplessness and hopelessness? Haha, yeah. So there's sort of two parts to that. The first part that I would say is in people who get to that stage, usually it depends if we're talking at a small scale, like individual to individual, or if we're talking large scale social, like full community. Individual to individual, that's like one person manipulating another person in an interpersonal relationship, and that can be very abusive and dangerous. And so I would say like that is absolutely like where someone needs to reach out for help, like help with friends. If you notice it, like reach out to them, like find like that there needs to be some broader support system put into place to help that person to extract themselves from that traumatizing or abusive or dangerous relationship, okay? Because when you said learned helplessness, that's like someone has taught them that they are helpless, that they're hopeless, and that therefore maybe they're dependent on the abuser, okay? So that's like a very important thing. I put this information up here. I know you've probably read it, just to provide access to some places where you could find support like that. On the other hand, that is a strategy, a political strategy these days, I think, is to create social fatigue and exhaustion, feeling of hopelessness. Because, you know, it's a different, like, it's one of the many ways that a state, like an established political power, can maintain their power. Because if the people who want to change things get too tired to work anymore, to try anymore, like we don't want to try, we're like, why try? Well, that's like a really easy way for them to win. It's like getting the team on the field that you're playing in sports to not care about trying to run after the ball anymore. If you can get the other team to not care about the ball, it's the easiest way to win that match. And so I would say that identifying those actors or agents that might be creating that in society is very important. And all of us, based on our own positions, will maybe identify or think about those in different ways. But knowing what they are, and I would say finding ways to promote optimistic conversations that aren't dictated by their terms. So for me, it might be like sensational political statements that come out of different parts of the US political spectrum, I don't let them get to me, because what they want is they want to get to me, and they want to distract me, and they want to exhaust me. And I focus on, no, there's some big things that I care about that I'm working with people on that are going to take a long time to make happen. And I can't waste this time with them. And what I will say is this, it takes a lifetime to figure out some of those things, but recognize that that is a known strategy in the political landscape, is to distract people, make them angry, do things that, apologies for my language, piss you off, so that then you burn up your energy because you're just so angry, right? Because anger actually is something that in theory, you can actually resist. Or maybe you're so angry that you make dumb decisions, right? The worst thing for an established political party is an informed electorate that has a lot of time to evaluate and consider the decisions that are being made, because then the elected representatives, well, they've got to do a better job, and they got to be more accountable to the electorate. So, I would say that one of the for those of us, some of us are under incredible pressure. And for those of you who are, please reach out to people, me, other people, for support during your time of difficulty, stress, and pressure. But for those of us who are afforded time and space, now is an incredible time to start to think more broadly about what are the things that we want to happen. This is a great time to organize, to get organized, to think about what do we want to be doing? What do we want this place to be like when we come out of this? What are the things that we're really, really, really committed to? And what are some really smart steps that we can take? And start to make the conversation happen more on our terms. And saying that doesn't mean that we're going to get our way. It just means that the conversation isn't dictated by the side that is trying to provoke us, if that makes sense. I think that's the last question, unless there's any people who would like to ask verbally, which is perfectly fine too. If not, it's a beautiful Saturday. And those of you who are in Hong Kong, you could absolutely go out and enjoy it, because it is pretty stunning. I may do that myself for a little while. Mask on, a little bit of walking, waving to people in my neighborhood. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for this time, and thank you for giving me the space to share my perspectives today. I really appreciate it.
All right, thank you, Ian. And let's meet as soon as possible. All right.
I would love that.
And thank you for all the attendees. Thank you for your questions. And we hope that you will join other talks organized by the Arts Faculty. Thank you again, Ian, and see you soon.
Cheers. Bye-bye. Stay well, everyone. Bye-bye.